The commercial airliner shuddered violently at 37,000 feet, jarring passengers from their mid-flight stupor. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, barely masking his panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. If there are any military pilots aboard, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." In seat 23B, Lieutenant Colonel Kira Ghost, Washington opened her eyes slowly, the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like an old flight jacket. She'd been dozing, catching precious rest between assignments, her Army combat aviation uniform wrinkled from the long journey home from Bagram. Around her, passengers whispered nervously, their eyes darting toward the windows where the afternoon sky stretched endlessly blue. The aircraft lurched again, more violent this time. Oxygen masks dropped like yellow flowers blooming in unison. Kira's trained ear caught the subtle change in engine pitch. The starboard turbine was struggling, maybe worse. She'd heard that sound before over the Hindu Kush, when her Black Hawk took shrapnel during a medical evacuation run that saved 14 wounded Marines. A flight attendant stumbled down the aisle, her professional composure cracking. "Ma'am," she said, leaning toward an elderly man in uniform, "are you military?" "Retired Navy," he wheezed, fumbling with his oxygen mask. "But I was a cook, not a pilot." Kira remained silent, watching. She knew what would happen next, the assumptions, the dismissal, the inevitable surprise when they discovered that the unassuming black woman in the middle seat had logged over 3,000 combat flight hours and held one of the Army's most respected call signs. The aircraft banked sharply, throwing passengers against their seats. Through the small window, Kira glimpsed the ground far below, a patchwork of farmland and suburban sprawl. Beautiful and terrifying from this height, especially in a crippled bird with 200 souls aboard. Captain Morrison's voice returned, higher now, desperation bleeding through his professional training. "This is urgent. We need any pilot, military, civilian, anyone with aviation experience, to please come forward immediately." Kira unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movements fluid despite the aircraft's erratic motion. She'd made this decision 100 times before, in situations where hesitation meant death. The passenger across from her, a middle-aged businessman who'd spent the first hour of the flight loudly discussing his golf handicap, looked at her with confusion. "Where you going, miss?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Kira glanced at him, her dark eyes steady despite the chaos around them. "To work," she said simply, then began moving forward through the cabin, past rows of frightened faces, toward a cockpit where two civilian pilots were about to learn that their salvation wore captain's bars and had earned her call sign in the mountains of Afghanistan. The real story was just beginning. The flight attendant who'd been searching for pilots nearly collided with Kira as she approached the front of the cabin. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said, her voice strained but still attempting authority. "We're dealing with an emergency." "I know," Kira replied calmly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Washington, Army Combat Aviation. You need a pilot." The attendant's eyes widened, taking in Kira's uniform, her bearing, the subtle authority that seemed to emanate from her small frame. Let me get the captain." Behind them, the aircraft shuddered again, and several passengers screamed. Kira felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, but the hyper-awareness that came before action. She'd felt it over Kandahar when Taliban fighters locked onto her helicopter with an RPG. She'd felt it during the sandstorm extraction that earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross. She felt it now, 37,000 feet above Indiana, as a civilian airliner began its dance with disaster. Captain Morrison emerged from the cockpit, his face pale and drawn. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with the clean-cut look of commercial aviation. His eyes swept over her, lingering on her gender, her race, the worn patches on her uniform. "You're military?" he asked, and Kira heard the doubt in his voice. "Rotary wing," she confirmed. "But I've got fixed-wing time. What's your situation?" Morrison hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether to trust a helicopter pilot with his aircraft. "Hydraulic failure, possibly catastrophic. We're losing control authority. My co-pilot." He gestured helplessly toward the cockpit. "Food poisoning. He's been sick for an hour." Through the open cockpit door, Kira could see the instrument panel, a constellation of red warning lights that told a grim story. She'd seen similar displays in combat, when systems failed and options narrowed to desperate choices. "What's your flight time?" Morrison asked, still uncertain. 3,000 hours combat, 800 fixed-wing civilian. I'm instrument-rated, multi-engine commercial. Kira's voice remained steady, professional. She didn't mention the nights over Afghanistan, the emergency landings in sandstorms, the times she'd brought damaged aircraft home through sheer will and skill. Morrison's radio crackled with air traffic control. "United 1847, say nature of emergency. We're showing you off course and descending." "Copy ATC," Morrison replied, his voice breaking slightly. "We have hydraulic issues and are requesting vectors to nearest suitable airport." Kira stepped forward. "Captain, you need help in there, I'm offering." She saw the moment Morrison made his decision, desperation overriding prejudice, necessity trumping assumption. He nodded curtly and gestured toward the cockpit. As they entered the confined space, Kira's trained eyes swept the instruments. Hydraulic pressure was dropping fast on two systems. They had maybe 20 minutes before manual control became nearly impossible. She slipped into the co-pilot's seat, her hands automatically finding the familiar positions, muscle memory bridging the gap between rotary and fixed wing. "Talk to me," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that made Morrison straighten unconsciously. The aircraft was dying around them, but for the first time in an hour, Captain Morrison felt a flicker of hope. "Hydraulics are failing across multiple systems," Morrison explained, his hands gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. "We've lost most of our flight control authority. The aircraft is becoming increasingly difficult to control." Kira's eyes moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. Oil pressure on the number 2 engine was fluctuating. Hydraulic fluid quantity was dropping steadily on both primary and backup systems. She'd seen similar cascading failures before, but never at this altitude, never with this many civilian lives at stake. "What's your fuel state?" she asked, already calculating glide ratios and emergency landing options. 18,000 pounds. We were 40 minutes out from Chicago when this started." The radio crackled again. "United 1847, Chicago approach. We're showing you in a rapid descent. Confirm you're declaring an emergency." Morrison reached for the radio, but Kira's hand intercepted his. "Let me," she said quietly. She keyed the microphone with the calm professionalism that had once guided rescue helicopters through Taliban territory. "Chicago approach, United 1847. We are declaring a mayday. We have multiple hydraulic failures, partial loss of flight controls, and are requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport. We have 212 souls on board, fuel for approximately 30 minutes. The controller's voice came back crisp and professional. "United 1847, Mayday acknowledged. Turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 8,000. Indianapolis International is at your 11 o'clock, 22 miles. Kira looked at Morrison. "Can you make that turn?" He tried, muscles straining against the unresponsive controls. The aircraft banked sluggishly to the left, but they were losing altitude faster than planned. "It's not responding properly," he said through gritted teeth. "Let me try something," Kira said. She'd learned unconventional control techniques in Afghanistan when damaged aircraft required creative solutions. She adjusted the throttles asymmetrically, using engine power to help steer the aircraft. The Boeing responded, banking more smoothly to the left. Morrison looked at her with surprise and growing respect. "Where did you learn that?" "Combat," she replied simply. "You use whatever works to get everyone home." Behind them, the passenger cabin had grown quiet with the focused silence of people understanding their mortality. Through the cockpit door, Kira could see faces pressed against windows, watching the ground grow closer with each passing minute. Her radio training kicked in as she coordinated with approach control, her voice steady and professional despite the chaos around them. "Chicago approach, 1847. We're going to need emergency equipment standing by. Our hydraulic situation is deteriorating rapidly." "Copy 1847. Indianapolis is rolling the trucks. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. You're cleared for any runway." Kira felt the familiar calm that came in the moments before action. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd lived through in combat zones half a world away. The sky outside was peaceful, deceptively serene, but she knew that in the next 20 minutes, her skills would determine whether 200 people lived or died. The aircraft lurched suddenly, dropping several hundred feet before Morrison regained partial control. "We're running out of time," he said. "Then we better get to work," Kira replied. Indianapolis International Airport materialized through the windscreen like a promise of salvation, its runways stretching long and straight across the Indiana landscape. But Kira knew that getting there was only half the battle. Landing a hydraulically compromised aircraft with minimal flight controls would test every skill she'd learned in 20 years of military aviation. "United 1847, Indianapolis Tower," the radio crackled. "You're cleared to land runway 5 right, winds calm. Emergency equipment is standing by." Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead. "I don't know if I can do this. The controls are barely responding." Kira studied the approach path, calculating angles and speeds with the precision of someone who'd made emergency landings under fire. "We're going to do this together," she said. "I'll handle power and trim, you maintain heading as best you can." She could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, their red and white lights flashing in the afternoon sun. It reminded her of forward operating bases, where similar vehicles waited for incoming medical helicopters carrying wounded soldiers. The aircraft was descending too fast, their glide path steep and unstable. Kira adjusted the throttles, trying to balance speed with control authority. Too much power and they'd overshoot the runway. Too little and they'd hit short. "Gear down," Morrison called, reaching for the landing gear lever. "Wait," Kira said. "With our hydraulic problems, the gear might not lock properly. Let's get closer first." Through the side window, she could see cars on the interstate below pulling over, people standing outside to watch their approach. The weight of responsibility settled heavier on her shoulders, not just the passengers behind them, but the families on the ground who might be in danger if they didn't make the runway. 2 miles out," Morrison announced, his voice tight with concentration. Kira keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Lieutenant Colonel Washington. We're making our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are tight, heads down, brace position. We're going to get through this." Her calm voice seemed to steady the passengers. Through the cockpit door, she could see them following her instructions, the cabin crew moving efficiently to prepare for emergency landing procedures. The runway grew larger in the windscreen, its numbers and markings becoming clearer. 5 right, she memorized the layout, the length, the overrun areas. In Afghanistan, she'd landed damaged helicopters on shorter, rougher surfaces, but never with this many lives depending on her judgment. "Gear down now," she said. Morrison lowered the landing gear. They waited, watching the indicators. 2 green lights, 1 red. The nose gear wasn't showing locked. "We're coming in hot," Morrison said, watching their airspeed. "I know," Kira replied, her hands moving across the throttles with surgical precision. "But we're coming in alive." The approach continued, each second bringing them closer to the moment of truth, closer to the test that would define not just her skills, but her legacy. The runway threshold rushed up to meet them, concrete and asphalt stretching ahead like a gray river of hope. Kira felt the familiar weight of command responsibility, the same feeling she'd carried over every landing zone in Afghanistan where wounded soldiers waited for evacuation. 50 feet, Morrison called out, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The aircraft was still descending too fast, but Kira held her throttle adjustment steady. Too aggressive a correction now could stall them short of the runway. She'd learned this lesson the hard way during a night medical evacuation when Taliban tracers lit up the sky around her helicopter. 30 feet, 20. The main gear touched down hard, the aircraft bouncing once before settling. Morrison fought the controls as they rolled down the center line, the disabled nose gear creating a slight shimmy but holding. "Reverse thrust," Kira called, her hands already moving to help Morrison manage the controls. They slowed gradually, emergency vehicles packing them along the runway. Through the windscreen, Kira could see firefighters in their silver suits, paramedics ready with stretchers, the coordinated ballet of emergency response. United 1847, Indianapolis Tower. Outstanding job. Taxi to Gate 12, emergency equipment will escort you. As they rolled clear of the runway, Morrison slumped in his seat, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. "Jesus," he whispered, "I couldn't have done that alone." Behind them, the passenger cabin erupted in applause and tears. Through the cockpit door, Kira could see people embracing, flight attendants crying with relief, passengers pulling out phones to call loved ones. "Tower, this is United 1847, Kira keyed the radio. "We're clear of the runway, all souls safe. Thank you for your assistance." "Copy 1847, welcome to Indianapolis." Morrison looked at her with something approaching awe. "What did you say your call sign was?" "Ghost," Kira replied quietly. "They called me Ghost because I could appear when people needed help most, then disappear before anyone could properly thank me." She began unbuckling her harness, preparing to fade back into anonymity, just another passenger on a flight that had almost ended in disaster. But Morrison caught her arm. "Wait," he said, "the passengers, they should know who saved them." Kira shook her head. "They should know we saved them. You flew this aircraft when it didn't want to be flown. That took courage." But even as she tried to deflect attention, she knew something had changed. Word would spread. Stories would be told. The black woman in 23B who'd slept through takeoff had just proven once again that heroes don't always look like what people expect. The aircraft door opened, and cool Indiana air flowed into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of freedom and second chances. As passengers filed off the aircraft, many stopped to thank Kira, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and newfound respect. She accepted their thanks graciously but briefly, already thinking about her connecting flight, her next assignment, the ongoing mission that had defined her career. Captain Morrison walked with her toward the gate. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When I first saw you, I made assumptions." "Most people do," Kira replied without bitterness. "It's not about what people think when they first see you. It's about what they think after you do your job." A journalist from the local news station intercepted them at the gate, microphone ready. "Ma'am, can you tell us about the emergency landing? We understand you're military." Kira paused, considering. She'd spent most of her career in the shadows, her achievements known only within military circles. But maybe, just maybe, visibility mattered. Maybe young girls needed to see that heroes came in all colors, all genders. "Lieutenant Colonel Kira Washington, U.S. Army Combat Aviation," she said, facing the camera. We had a mechanical emergency, and the crew did an outstanding job bringing everyone home safely. But you're the one who landed the plane. Captain Morrison and I worked together. That's how aviation works: teamwork, training, and doing whatever it takes to complete the mission. The journalist pressed for more details, but Kira excused herself politely. She had a connection to catch, and the Army expected her back at Bragg by 800 the next morning. As she walked through the terminal, she passed a young black girl, maybe 10 years old, watching the news coverage on a monitor. Their eyes met briefly, and Kira saw something spark in the child's expression: curiosity, recognition, possibility. That look reminded her why she joined the military in the first place, back when she was that young girl's age, watching news coverage of the Gulf War and wondering if someone like her could ever fly those impressive machines across desert skis. Her phone buzzed with a text from her commanding officer. "Saw the news. Well done, Ghost. Safe travels." She smiled, shouldering her bag and heading toward her gate. Behind her, the story was already spreading through social media, news outlets, and the informal networks that carry tales of quiet heroism. But Kira Washington, call sign Ghost, was already thinking about tomorrow's mission, the next challenge, the ongoing duty that had shaped her life. The sky outside the terminal windows was turning gold with sunset, beautiful and infinite, full of promise for those brave enough to claim it. 3 months later, the story had taken on a life of its own. The cell phone videos from passengers had gone viral, accumulating millions of views across social media platforms. News outlets from CNN to the BBC had covered the incident, often leading with headlines about the mysterious military pilot who'd saved United Flight 1847. But Kira Washington continued her duties at Fort Bragg, training the next generation of Army aviators. She'd been promoted to full colonel, a recognition that came with new responsibilities and the knowledge that her actions above Indiana had elevated her profile within military leadership circles. On this particular morning, she stood before a class of flight school candidates, 24 young men and women who'd committed to earning their wings in service to their country. Among them were faces that reflected America's diversity: white and black, Latino and Asian, urban and rural backgrounds united by their shared dream of military aviation. "Anyone can learn to fly an aircraft," she told them, her voice carrying the authority of hard-earned experience. "The question is whether you can fly it when everything goes wrong, when the systems fail, when the weather turns bad, when people are depending on you to make the right decision under impossible circumstances." A young woman in the front row, Second Lieutenant Maria Santos, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you stay calm in emergencies?" Kira considered the question, remembering the weight of responsibility she'd felt in that airliner cockpit. "Training prepares you technically," she said, "but ultimately it comes down to understanding that being afraid is normal. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing your job despite being afraid." After class, she walked across the flight line where Black Hawks sat ready for training missions. The sight of the helicopters still stirred something in her chest, the same excitement she'd felt as a young lieutenant earning her wings 2 decades earlier. Her aide, Captain Johnson, approached with a stack of paperwork. "Ma'am, you have 3 more interview requests from news organizations, and the Pentagon wants to know if you're available for a speaking engagement next month." Kira sighed. The attention was flattering but sometimes overwhelming. She joined the Army to fly, not to be a spokesperson. "What's the speaking engagement?" "National Women in Aviation Conference. They want you as the keynote speaker." She thought about that 10-year-old girl in the Indianapolis airport, the spark of possibility she'd seen in young eyes. "Schedule it," she said, "but make sure they know I want to talk about the future of aviation, not just one emergency landing." That evening, Kira sat in her quarters reviewing flight training reports. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Morrison. Thought you'd want to see this. Attached was a photo of a young black woman in Air Force blues standing beside a T-38 trainer aircraft. The caption read, "Inspired by Colonel Washington's story, just soloed in pilot training. Thank you for showing us what's possible." Kira smiled, remembering her own first solo flight, the exhilaration of lifting off alone, trusting her training and instincts. That feeling, that moment of pure freedom and responsibility, was what she wanted to pass on to the next generation. Outside her window, the sounds of evening training flights filled the air. Helicopters returning from missions, fixed-wing aircraft practicing approaches, the ongoing rhythm of military aviation that had become the soundtrack of her life. Her call sign had earned new meaning since Indianapolis. Ghost was no longer just about appearing when needed, but about the lasting impact of quiet professionalism and competent leadership. The story of Flight 1847 was becoming part of aviation lore, but Kira Washington was already focused on tomorrow's mission, the next flight, the ongoing duty that defined her purpose. The sky was infinite, full of possibilities for those brave enough to claim it, and she intended to keep flying as long as the Army would let her. The annual Army Aviation Awards ceremony took place 6 months later at the National Museum of the United States Army. The auditorium was filled with aviators from across the service, their dress uniforms crisp with ribbons and badges that told stories of service in Iraq, Afghanistan, and peacekeeping missions around the world. Colonel Kira Washington sat in the front row, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its importance. She'd been selected to receive the Distinguished Service Medal, the Army's recognition for exceptionally meritorious service. But more significantly, she'd been chosen to present the award for Outstanding Young Aviator to Lieutenant Santos, her former student who distinguished herself during a recent humanitarian mission in Honduras. As the ceremony began, Kira reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 22 years earlier, she'd been a young second lieutenant from Detroit, the daughter of an auto worker and a teacher, determined to prove that she belonged in military aviation despite the skepticism she encountered. General Patricia Matthews, the Army's first female four-star general, approached the podium. "Today we recognize excellence in Army aviation," she began. "But we also celebrate the evolution of our service, the way exceptional individuals change not just missions, but perceptions." When Kira's name was called, she walked to the stage with the measured pace of someone accustomed to ceremony. General Matthews pinned the medal to her uniform, then stepped aside for Kira to address the audience. "I've been asked to speak about leadership," Kira began, her voice carrying to the back of the auditorium. "But leadership isn't about titles or recognition. It's about competence, consistency, and caring more about the mission than your own comfort." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, young and old, male and female, representing every background America had to offer. "When I was a young aviator, I thought I had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. I was probably right. But what I learned is that excellence is its own reward. When you do your job with skill and integrity, when you put service before self, recognition becomes secondary to the satisfaction of knowing you made a difference." In the audience, she spotted familiar faces, former students who'd gone on to command positions, fellow combat veterans who'd served in Afghanistan and Iraq, young aviators just beginning their careers. Among them sat Captain Morrison, who'd flown in for the ceremony, and Lieutenant Santos, whose own story of achievement was just beginning to unfold. "The sky doesn't care about your gender or your race," Kira continued. "Physics doesn't discriminate. The aircraft responds to skill, preparation, and sound judgment. Everything else is just noise." After the ceremony, during the reception, a young cadet approached her. "Ma'am, I'm starting flight school next month. Any advice?" Kira smiled, remembering asking similar questions to her own mentors decades earlier. "Study hard, fly smart, And never forget that every time you take controls of an aircraft, you're carrying on a tradition of aviators who pushed boundaries and expanded possibilities. Later that evening, alone in her hotel room, Kira opened her laptop and began typing her after-action report from the Honduras mission. Tomorrow she'd return to Fort Bragg, to the daily routine of training flights and administrative duties that formed the backbone of her service. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The story that had begun with a sleeping passenger on United Flight 1847 had become something larger, a reminder that competence and character could overcome assumptions, that quiet professionalism often spoke louder than publicity. The ceremony had been about recognition, but Kira's real legacy was already taking shape in the young aviators she'd trained, the barriers she'd broken, the example she'd set for those who would follow. The sky remained infinite, full of possibilities for those brave enough to claim it, and she'd helped ensure that claim was open to everyone who earned it. 2 years after Indianapolis, Colonel Kira Washington received an assignment that would define the final chapter of her military career. She was selected to command the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment's newest Aviation Support Battalion, a position that came with the responsibility for training the Army's most elite helicopter pilots. The 160th SOAR, known as the Night Stalkers, represented the pinnacle of Army aviation. Their motto, "Death waits in the dark," reflected their role in the most sensitive special operations missions around the world. For Kira, the assignment was both validation and challenge, recognition that her skills and leadership had earned respect at the highest levels of military aviation. Her first morning at Fort Campbell, she stood before 50 of the Army's most experienced pilots. These were aviators who'd flown missions in Syria, Iraq, Somalia, and classified locations that wouldn't appear in any official records. Many had initially questioned the appointment of someone whose recent fame came from a civilian aircraft emergency. "I know some of you are wondering what a helicopter pilot who became famous on a commercial airliner is doing here," she began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. "Let me tell you about a night in Afghanistan when my crew and I extracted 14 wounded Marines from a Taliban ambush. We took heavy fire, lost hydraulics, and had to land in a hot zone with no backup." She paused, making eye contact with skeptical faces in the audience. "I didn't become famous that night. The families of those Marines went home whole, and that was enough. The Indianapolis flight was just good flying under pressure, the same skills you use every time you launch on a mission." Over the following months, Kira transformed the training regimen. She instituted cross-training programs that exposed pilots to different aircraft types, understanding that versatility could save lives in unexpected situations. She established mentorship programs that paired experienced pilots with younger aviators, ensuring knowledge transfer that went beyond technical manuals. But her most significant contribution was cultural. Under her leadership, the battalion began recruiting more diverse candidates while maintaining the elite standards that defined special operations aviation. She understood that excellence had no demographic boundaries, and the military's most challenging missions required the best talent from every background. Chief Warrant Officer 5 David Chen, a veteran Night Stalker with 15 years in special operations, initially resisted some of her changes. But after observing her performance during a complex training exercise, where she successfully coordinated a multi-aircraft mission while simultaneously flying as pilot in command, his respect was earned. "Ma'am," he said after the exercise, "I've flown with a lot of commanders. You've got the touch." The touch was something indefinable that separated good pilots from exceptional ones. It was the ability to feel what an aircraft needed before instruments confirmed it, to make split-second decisions that saved lives, to inspire confidence in crews operating under extreme stress. During her tenure, The battalion's mission success rate improved while training accidents decreased. But more importantly, young aviators began seeing possibilities they'd never considered before. Applications from female candidates increased by 30%, and the quality of recruits from diverse backgrounds reached new levels. Kira's evening ritual remained unchanged, reviewing training reports, studying new tactics, preparing for the next day's challenges. But now she also spent time mentoring individual pilots, sharing lessons learned from 24 years of military aviation. The Indianapolis incident had made her famous, but Fort Campbell was making her legendary. Here, away from media attention, she was building the foundation for the future of special operations aviation, ensuring that the next generation of Night Stalkers would be even more capable than those who came before. In the final year of her military career, Colonel Washington faced a decision that would test everything she believed about duty and service. The Army offered her promotion to Brigadier General, a position that would take her away from flying and place her in the Pentagon, managing aviation programs from behind a desk in Washington, D.C. The promotion represented the ultimate recognition of her achievements, a black woman rising to general officer rank in Army aviation, breaking barriers that had stood for decades. It would secure her legacy within military circles and provide a platform for influencing policy at the highest levels. But it would also end her flying career. Generals didn't pilot helicopters on training missions or teach young aviators the subtleties of auto-rotation landings. They attended meetings, managed budgets, and navigated the complex politics of military bureaucracy. Kira spent weeks considering the decision, seeking counsel from mentors and peers. General Matthews encouraged her to accept, arguing that representation at senior levels mattered for future generations of military women. Colonel Chen suggested she could have more impact as a general than as a field-grade officer. Her final decision came during a routine training flight over Kentucky's rolling hills. She was instructing a young warrant officer named Jessica Murphy, a recent flight school graduate from rural Montana, who reminded Kira of herself at that age, skilled but uncertain, determined but occasionally overwhelmed by the responsibility. As they practiced emergency procedures, Murphy made a critical error that could have been dangerous in actual combat conditions. Instead of ending the flight, Kira patiently talked her through the correct procedures, sharing techniques she'd learned through hard experience in Afghanistan. "Flying isn't just about mechanical skill," she told Murphy as they returned to Campbell Army Airfield. "It's about judgment, about understanding that every decision you make affects not just you, but everyone depending on you." That evening, Kira called the personnel assignment officer and declined the promotion. She would retire as a colonel, ending her career where she'd found her true calling, in the cockpit, training the next generation of military aviators. The decision surprised many, but it reflected Kira's understanding of her own strengths and passions. She could have been an effective general, but she chose to remain what she'd always been, a pilot first, a teacher second, an inspiration through example rather than rank. Her retirement ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at Fort Campbell. The reviewing stand was filled with dignitaries, fellow officers, and aviators whose careers she'd influenced. But Kira's attention was focused on the flight line, where a formation of US-60 Black Hawks sat ready for a final flyover in her honor. As the helicopters thundered overhead in perfect formation, she felt the familiar stirring in her chest that had defined her career. The sky was infinite, full of possibilities for those brave enough to claim it, and she'd helped ensure that claim was open to everyone who earned it. Her legacy wasn't measured in rank or recognition, but in the pilots she'd trained, the barriers she'd broken, and the quiet professionalism that had redefined what leadership looked like in military aviation. 5 years after retirement, Dr. Kira Washington, she'd earned a doctorate in aerospace engineering while transitioning to civilian life, stood before a packed auditorium at MIT. Her hair was now silver at the temples, and she wore a simple blue dress rather than military uniform, but her presence commanded the same respect she'd earned in cockpits around the world. "When I was 8 years old," she began her commencement address, "I watched news coverage of the Gulf War and saw military helicopters crossing the desert. I told my mother I wanted to fly those machines someday. She said, 'Baby, the military doesn't look like you.'" She wasn't being discouraging. She was being realistic about the world as it existed then. The graduating class included students from every background, young minds prepared to tackle challenges in aerospace engineering, artificial intelligence, and technologies not yet imagined. Among them were several military veterans, their experiences in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other theaters adding practical wisdom to academic theory. "My mother was right about the military as it existed then," Kira continued. "But she underestimated something important. People like you can change what institutions look like. You can expand definitions of normal. You can prove that competence has no demographic boundaries." After the ceremony, she visited the MIT Wind Tunnel Laboratory, where students tested designs for next-generation aircraft. The technology amazed her. Computer modeling that could simulate flight conditions with precision unimaginable during her early career, materials that were stronger and lighter than anything she'd flown. But the fundamental challenge remained unchanged, putting human beings in machines that defied gravity, asking them to master complex systems while making life-and-death decisions under pressure. The technology evolved, but the need for skilled, dedicated aviators remained constant. Her consulting company specialized in aviation safety and training, work that kept her connected to the flying community while allowing her to influence industry standards. She'd helped develop new training protocols adopted by both military and civilian aviation organizations, programs that emphasized the cross-training and adaptability she championed during her Army career. The Indianapolis incident was now part of aviation history, studied in flight schools as an example of crew resource management and emergency decision-making. But Kira's continuing work ensured her influence extended far beyond one dramatic landing. She maintained correspondence with dozens of former students, many now in command positions themselves. Captain Morrison had become a Czech airman, using his experience from Flight 1847 to train other pilots in emergency procedures. Lieutenant Santos commanded her own aviation unit, leading missions in Africa and South America. That evening, in her hotel room overlooking the Charles River, Kira opened her laptop and reviewed applications for the scholarship fund she'd established. The Washington Aviation Education Foundation provided financial support for underrepresented students pursuing careers in military or civilian aviation. This year's recipients included a young woman from Alabama whose father was a mechanic, a Latino man from Los Angeles whose family had immigrated from El Salvador, and a Native American woman from New Mexico who wanted to become a test pilot. Each represented the expanding possibility that Kira had spent her career helping to create. Her phone buzzed with a text from